The Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 8 has arrived, and this time around Samsung hasn't simply refined last year's Fold, it has changed the formula. The Galaxy Z Fold 7 had that familiar tall cover display and a larger inner screen that leaned heavily into productivity. With the Fold 8, Samsung has gone in a different direction. The regular Fold is now shorter, wider, and much more focused on things like watching movies, playing games, using social media, messaging, and all the everyday stuff we normally do on a smartphone. Samsung hasn't completely abandoned the productivity-focused Fold concept. Instead, that idea has effectively been moved up to the Galaxy Z Fold 8 Ultra, which is also the more expensive model. And after using the regular Fold 8 for a week, I actually think Samsung might have stumbled onto something important here. The new proportions make this phone feel much more approachable. It's easier to use with one hand, the outer display makes more sense for everyday apps, and the whole thing feels less like a mini laptop and more like a normal phone that happens to unfold into a tablet. That sounds like a small distinction, but it changes the experience quite a bit. The first thing you notice about the Galaxy Z Fold 8 is that it doesn't really look like the Samsung Fold phones we have been using for the last several years. The overall book style concept is still here, obviously, but Samsung has completely reworked the proportions. Instead of the tall and narrow cover screen we have become used to, the Z Fold 8 gives you a 5.5-inch 16:10 outer display. It's noticeably shorter and wider, with a shape that reminds me more of a passport than a traditional Fold. Open it up, you get a 7.8-inch internal display with a 3:4 aspect ratio, which is much closer to the shape of a conventional tablet. And honestly, I understood what Samsung was doing almost immediately. I have used book-style foldables like the Galaxy Z Fold 7 and the Oppo Find N6 for extended periods, but the Fold 8 feels dramatically easier to live with than those taller designs. The outer display is the biggest reason why. The wider shape makes it much easier to type, scroll, read messages, and interact with apps without needing to open the phone every few seconds. TikTok looks good, YouTube works well, games feel more natural. Even basic things like Google Maps benefits from having a little more horizontal room. That might not sound revolutionary on paper, but when you use the phone throughout the day, the difference adds up. There is also something about the Fold 8's proportions that makes it feel like it sits between two categories. You still have the full-size inner display of a traditional book-style foldable, but when the phone is closed, the experience is much closer to using a compact device. I think that balance is one of the strongest things about the Z Fold 8. Then there is the weight. At just 201 grams, this is an incredibly light book-style foldable. It's actually lighter than Samsung Galaxy S26 Ultra, which is kind of ridiculous when you stop and think about it. And because this is a phone you are potentially going to hold while watching videos, browsing social media, gaming, or reading for long stretches, that weight reaction makes a meaningful difference. The phone doesn't feel like something you have to tolerate just because you want a foldable, it feels comfortable. The smaller overall body also makes it easier to carry in your pocket. The Fold 8 doesn't have that long, bulky feeling that previous Samsung Folds often had. The hinge is an interesting part of the design too. Compared with the Fold 8 Ultra, the hinge on the regular Fold 8 isn't as flexible. Getting it to sit comfortably halfway open in some of the laptop style positions takes a little more adjustment. But there is a benefit to the tighter hinge. Opening the phone feels effortless. You can pop it open with one hand without having to fight against the hinge, and Samsung says that decision was deliberate because the regular Fold is supposed to be used more like an everyday phone than a productivity workstation. You can still position the display halfway open too. You could use it in tense mode or prop it up in a laptop style arrangement if you want to. I just don't think most people will use that feature very often, especially because the 3:4 inner display isn't particularly tailored to that workflow. For those who genuinely want that kind of setup, the Fold 8 Ultra makes more sense. Samsung has also kept the usual premium color selection. You get graphite, cream, lavender, and pistachio, with pistachio being exclusive to the Samsung store. Durability is more familiar territory. The Fold 8 carries an IP48 rating, which gives you protection against water and larger particles, and Samsung says it can handle being submerged in up to 1.5 meters of water for as long as 30 minutes. But dust protection hasn't really moved forward. Particles smaller than 1 mm can still potentially get inside the phone, so you still need to be a little careful in particularly dusty environments. At this point, Google is still one of the few companies to really address the difficult combination of dust and water resistance on foldables, so Samsung's approach isn't particularly unusual. It just means there is still room for improvement. One of the biggest weaknesses of older Samsung Folds was that the cover display often feel like something you used only when you absolutely had to. That isn't really the case with the Z Fold 8. The 5.5-inch outer screen is actually one of my favorite parts of the phone. The 16:10 ratio gives it a wider footprint, so typing, messaging, social media, browsing, and navigation all feel more natural. It also gives you more room for images and text than Samsung's previous tall cover displays, and that makes you don't have to unfold the phone just to do basic smartphone tasks. That's a big deal. Gaming is another area where the wider screen works nicely. It feels less constrained than older fold cover displays, and watching 16:9 content on Netflix is also pretty good. You still get small black bars, but the video occupies a larger portion of the screen than it does on some of Samsung's more square foldables. What impressed me most is that it doesn't feel cramped. At only 5.5 inches, that could have been a problem, but Samsung has chosen the aspect ratio carefully and it works. The quality is also flagship level, which makes a difference. This isn't a basic outer panel that exists just to get you through the day. It feels like a screen you could actually use as your primary display. Then of course there is a big internal panel. The 7.8-inch foldable display is exactly what you would expect from a high-end Samsung phone. You get dynamic AMOLED 2X, LTPO technology, a 120Hz refresh rate, and up to 3000 nits of peak brightness. It's bright, smooth, colorful, and extremely detailed. But the two things that really stand out to me are the shape of the display and the crease. The 3:4 aspect ratio might not sound like a huge change compared with previous folds, but in actual use, it makes a noticeable difference. Apps feel much more natural on the inner screen. WhatsApp works, Slack works, Instagram works, YouTube works, and in many cases, you can use them in landscape orientation without constantly wondering whether the interface is going to break or look strange. That was something I found surprisingly refreshing. With older foldables, opening a particular app sometimes came with a little uncertainty. You'd wonder whether the layout would fit properly, whether content would be cropped, or whether you'd have awkward empty spaces. With the Fold 8, I rarely thought about any of that. I just opened the app and it worked. The new shape also helps with video. Movies naturally fit the wider screen better, so although there are still black bars depending on the content, you get more usable screen real estate compared with some of Samsung's boxier designs. I actually ended up using the inner display in portrait mode quite a lot. It essentially becomes a massive smartphone screen, which is excellent for scrolling social media, playing portrait games, and watching vertical videos. TikTok in particular feels great on this display, while the Fold 8 is slightly less convincing is heavy-duty split-screen multitasking. You can still run two apps next to each other, and I used that setup regularly for things like messaging and browsing, but you don't have quite as much room as you do on the Fold 8 Ultra. Still, it's far more useful than trying to do the same thing on a conventional phone, so I wouldn't describe the Fold 8 as a bad productivity device. It simply isn't the best Samsung foldable for productivity anymore. Then there is a Flex Titanium. Samsung's new internal display technology uses two layers within the folding panel with the goal of making the screen stronger and reducing that obvious central crease, and I can definitely tell the difference. The internal panel feels more solid under your finger. There is less of that soft, flexible sensation that you get with some foldable displays, and the anti-reflective treatment also helps reduce the plastic-like reflections that have traditionally made foldable looks look less premium than standard glass displays. Then you look at the phone straight on and notice the crease, or rather you barely notice it. When the phone is lying flat, the center line is much harder to see than it has been on previous Samsung Folds. You can still spot it from certain angles, and yes, you can feel it when you run your finger over the middle. But visually, Samsung has made a pretty big improvement. I still think the Oppo Find N6 has a slight advantage when it comes to making the crease disappear, but Samsung has clearly taken a big step in the right direction. The Galaxy Z Fold 8 may sit below the Ultra, but Samsung hasn't exactly given it weak hardware. You are getting the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 for Galaxy, the same flagship processor used in the Galaxy S26 Ultra. There is also 12GB of RAM along with 256GB, 512GB or 1TB of storage. For regular use, the experience is exactly what you'd expect from those specifications. The phone feels fast, One UI responds quickly, apps open without delay, scrolling is smooth, and normal multitasking feels effortless. But the story changes when you start putting serious sustained pressure on the hardware. During testing, I noticed occasional shutters while editing complex 4K footage in CapCut Pad, particularly with multiple video layers. Demanding games can also expose the limits, something like uttering waves with the graphics turned all the way up can make the phone warm up surprisingly quickly. The chipset itself isn't the problem. The Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 is a very powerful platform. What seems to be holding the Fold 8 back is the physical design. It's thinner and smaller than the Fold 8 Ultra, which means there is less room to handle heat during long periods of heavy use. And once the temperature rises, sustained performance starts to suffer. Samsung's handling of benchmarking was also interesting. During my testing, standard apps like Geekbench 6 and 3D Mark were blocked. That isn't unheard of with unreleased smartphones. Xiaomi and Honor have done similar things with pre-launch hardware, but this was the first Samsung phone I have tested where I saw this kind of restriction. Even more interestingly, the Fold 8 Ultra did not have the same limitation. Fortunately, Geekbench 7 became available during my testing period, and because Samsung hadn't blocked it, I was able to get performance figures from the phone. The numbers basically confirmed what I had already experienced. The regular Fold 8 doesn't quite compete with the larger Fold 8 Ultra or some other book-style foldables when it comes to sustained CPU and GPU performance. But for everyday use, that difference is mostly theoretical. The phone still feels fast and responsive. You are not going to notice a problem while scrolling through One UI or opening apps. The issue really only shows up when you keep the phone under heavy load for an extended period. And that means most users probably won't care. But if you are buying this specifically because you want a foldable that doubles as a serious performance machine, it's worth knowing that the Ultra has the advantage. Here is where Samsung loses some of the momentum created by the new design. The Galaxy Z Fold 8 has a dual camera system with 50MP main sensor and a 50MP ultrawide, but there is no dedicated telephoto lens. And at this price, that feels like a compromise. I understand that Samsung wants to separate the regular Fold 8 from the more expensive Ultra, but this phone still costs significantly more than several conventional flagship phones that offer much more advanced camera hardware. You are paying more than an iPhone 17 Pro Max, for example, and more than the Oppo Find X9 Ultra. That makes the camera hardware harder to defend. It's also frustrating because last year's Z Fold 7 actually gave buyers more. You had a 200MP main camera, an ultra-wide and a dedicated zoom camera, all for roughly the same money. This year Samsung has reserved that more capable 3-camera system for the Fold 8 Ultra. The regular Fold 8 therefore makes to do with two 50-megapixel sensors. The main camera can produce strong results and the ultra-wide is useful, but once you need to zoom in, things become much less convincing. Samsung could have at least used the Ultra's 200-megapixel sensor to provide better digital or sensor-based zoom, but that isn't the case. So, if camera versatility is high on your list, this is probably the biggest weakness of the Fold 8. Here are some camera samples from the Galaxy Z Fold 8. The Galaxy Z Fold 8 is much more than just another yearly Fold upgrade. It represents a real change in how Samsung thinks about its regular book-style foldable. Previous Fold models were increasingly defined by productivity. Samsung wanted them to feel like mini workstations that happened to fit in your pocket. The Fold 8 takes a different approach. It wants to be a great everyday phone first and a tablet when you need one, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The shorter, wider design makes the outer display dramatically easier to use. The 201-gram weight makes the phone comfortable to carry and hold. The 7.8-inch internal display is excellent, and the much less visible crease makes the folding experience feel more mature. There are still some clear weaknesses. The camera setup is underwhelming for the price. The regular Fold 8 can't sustain performance quite as well as the larger Ultra, and heavy users may find the battery life a little too close to the edge. But after spending a week with it, none of those compromises changed my overall impression. In fact, the biggest surprise for me was how quickly I started preferring this design. The phone still gives you that huge inner display when you want it, but you no longer have to feel like you are sacrificing the everyday smartphone experience just to get a foldable. That's what makes the Galaxy Z Fold 8 so appealing. It's not necessarily Samsung's most powerful foldable, it's not the best camera phone in the price range, and it isn't the productivity king anymore. That's what the Z Fold 8 Ultra is for. But if you want a foldable that feels comfortable, practical, easy to use, and genuinely enjoyable every single day, the Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 8 is the one I'd take. And honestly, after using it, I'm not sure I want Samsung to go back to the old Fold design.